Hi, everyone. My name is Jay. Thank you so much for being here. At this time, there's so many more interesting things you could be doing. I really appreciate the support. I work on trying to understand fishing behavior. If you remember anything from the plenary session this morning, essentially, we were trying to understand how fishing effort or the decisions that fishers make that become fishing effort in the Maine lobster fishery. We said Maine because it turns out we don't have enough data for Canada. The intention was to do it for Canada as well. Anyway, yeah, we're part of the bioeconomic understanding fishing effort. How we're doing that is by making these mental models of decision making. Thank you so much for that keyword transition. That's great. Eventually, it does feed into a lobster fishery agent-based model. We'll talk about that later. What is fishing effort? Oftentimes, we think about it as a very singular sort of aggregate number that more or less represents how we think the fishery interacts with the world. And it's part of the because of management, because that's the way that we understand and manage fisheries, especially for the lobster fishery, where it's a very effort-based fishery, right? We don't have quotas, so we don't have quotas or we don't have any output regulations. We're only regulating what's going into the input. And it comes in many different flavors across which fishery you are part of, but it is some element of fishing gear and encounter with fish stocks. So how do fishers actually decide how they fish? Rather than for that question could be for the lobster fishery, how do fishers decide where to put their traps? But more further, how do fishers decide what about the fishing that they do that leads them to put their traps in that specific location at that time in this part of the year? Fishermen are equally as complex as the creatures that they fish. They have lives and dreams and hopes. They respond to multitudes of signals beyond just what's happening in the ocean. Each one of them is different. They all have different ways to respond to these signals. And that results being in fishers exhibit numerous different unique responses to various changes that they observe, not in just the ocean, but the price, the holiday schedules, for example, the availability of buyers, are some of the few things I can think off the top of my head. The social and economic drivers of fishermen influence fishing way more than we give credit for. And so the combination of these behaviors that become fishing effort can lead to long-term changes in the fleet composition that we either observe as very subtle or very large shifts. And so therefore, there's a need to understand both how fishers make decisions, the drivers of those decisions, and the emergent behaviors that come out of those decisions. How we do that is we used mental models, working with fishermen, trying to make a map of what they think it is fishing, or what they think they are doing while they're fishing. If you're not familiar with what mental models are, they're representations of cognitive pathways, including key components, relationships, and interactions. This could also include perceptions. This could include memory. This could include spatial relationships. There are so many ways you could do this. It's a lot of fun. It's a useful and effective communication tool for knowledge sharing. And this goes both ways, for me to share information to fishers and for them to share their information back to me. It's also really great at combining multiple sources of knowledge. So this is really useful when we're talking with multiple fishers from different regions all across the state. And it has been used previously to explore fishery issues and has been used to be implemented into management decisions before, so it's not a terribly new concept. I don't need to tell you much more about the Maine lobster fishery at this point. It's important, and we should care about it. If you were here for the first session, we also realized that while they are very profitable, they're also simultaneously vulnerable in ways that are hard to describe and measure. And it's sometimes a scary concept. And recently, there's been a lot of changes in the management and policy sides, along with the ecosystems that causes a lot of concern for the fishery. The reality is that the fishery today looks a lot different than what it did 5, 10, definitely 20 and 50 years ago. But the way that we try to characterize the fishery in the social science literature, or for example, or the way that we understand fishing effort still hasn't necessarily changed from when those rules were set 50 years ago. And so the questions that we explored were, how do lobster fishers make decisions about lobster fishing? The very specific questions within that are, what are the key drivers of decisions that they make in the fishery? And what key decisions are made? So what decisions are they making? What drives those decisions? What behaviors arise as a result of these decisions? And what needs to change for them to change their behaviors? How we did it is we did several focus group interviews between January and May early this year. We used the fuzzy cognitive mapping method using the mental modeler software. Essentially, what it allows us to do is create these spatial relationships between whatever you want, and we can also give it a positive or a negative directional value. The questions that we asked them to think about while we were running these focus groups were, what are the important things that pertain to your fishing, and what needs to happen in order for you to change what you do about it? We used predefined variables, which several of you in this room has helped me come up with. And we split the mental maps into short-run and long-run scenarios, and we can get into that later. And how we analyzed it, the transcripts afterwards, we used a thematic analysis using a simultaneous coding method. This is just a very quick example of mental modeler and sort of what exercises we were doing while we were doing those focus groups. Don't worry about it. It looks complex. This is their bridged version. This is the cumulative mental models for short run or operational fishing decision-making in the Maine lobster fishery. This is everything that they think about when they go out fishing, at least based off of the interviews that we did and other personal sort of interactions that I've had. Essentially, they think about where to fish, how you fish. It revolves around the fishing strategy that they develop, which is a combination of how many traps they're going to fish and how often they're going to fish them. They measure how well they're doing by varying degrees of how they understand success. They balance the trip costs. They try to maximize their catch. They minimize their input. They minimize the labor that they do. And who fishes actually determines a lot of the variability in fishing behaviors that we see. This is the long-run version of that, and this is thinking about across multiple years, like when you're at the end of the year doing your taxes, when you're thinking about saving up for something, when you're thinking about what you think you're going to be doing in about 5, 10 years. How we understood it is that you have several things that could happen in the future that influences how fishers think about what the future of the success of the fishery might be. They have these expectations about optimism for the fishery, and they can either invest or divest. Investing in this case means we meant to be interpreted to be expanding out a little bit more. Divesting is you do something else, you sell off your gear. There's so many different things they can do. All of this is balanced against the opportunity cost of investment, which is a complicated thing. And who they are and where they live also obviously matters in how they make these decisions. These maps are and have been shared with the fishermen that we've interviewed and that we work with. I'll need more time, but it'll be fine. I've made a video that sort of breaks this down in different sections and explains it to the fishermen. We're waiting to hear back on responses to see if they agree with this and if they see themselves reflected in this or not. Kathleen, you should see that. You should see that video. I'll send it to you. Anyway, so don't worry about that. The important things that came out of this was we identified several cost-saving strategies. One of the things they can do is they take less trips, and we see this happening in the fishery. The reason why they do is they increase their soak time by having more bait in their traps, so they don't have to go out as often. They're trying to maximize the catch per trip. Something else they could do is they could reduce their input costs. So maybe they're trying to use less bait per trap. They're trying to use less rope. They're trying to be more efficient with their fuel use. One of the first things that we hear people say is they also take less crew members. And so now they're taking a lot of the burden of the work on themselves rather than having help. Other things they could do is they could do their own maintenance, which comes with their own risk. And they could also reduce personal spending, or like a tightening belt strategy. A way you could visualize these cost-saving strategies is something like this, where they're increasing certain little bits of their trip costs, but on the idea that you're going to be reducing your total costs for the rest of the season. Long-term strategies, this is also illegal for me to use, but long-term strategies that we found was they could invest into the fishery where they're expanding their operations. Oftentimes this means investing into being able to fish more offshore, or investing to fish a longer period of time, or investing to have better efficiency of fishing. Oftentimes, if you are more positive in your perception of the fishery, or if you're expected to be in the fishery for a while, like you're young, or if you've been making a lot of money, this is the direction that people go. You could also downsize for the opposite of the same reasons. Oftentimes, we have people who are older who don't want to be fishing as hard anymore, and this is the direction that they take. You could divest. You could try something else. You could expand the capacity of your vessel to do a different sort of fishery. You could chase a different industry. This is where aquaculture can come in. And this isn't necessarily based off of perceptions of the future, but it could be driven by own financial risk tolerance. And lastly, you could exit, which is something that a lot of people do, but is a real strategy where they decide to stop because it either costs too much, it's too hard to do, or there are better opportunities out there. How this might be visualized, and this is not based off of real data because that data we do not have or we're still trying to figure out how to get, is if you have these sort of portfolios of individuals that exist along, at least for this axis, the economic dependency, so how much of their income is based off of lobstering, or their future perception, so how they think the fishery is going to do in the future, you can see how a very dependent fisher who is very optimistic would be much more likely to invest into the fishery following these sort of strategies, versus on the opposite, if you have somebody who thinks the fishery is going to crash and burn, or they have other sources of income and it's just like a hobby thing, then they can exit and it wouldn't actually affect them. And the thing I want you to take away from this is that it's a very complicated overlapping space between divesting, downsizing, investing, and exiting. And any fisher, depending on who they are, could exist in any form of these spaces. And if you have a pattern of how people exist in these spaces, then we can sort of understand how a pattern of how the fishery composition is changing over time. I will also reiterate that the behaviors are highly influenced by the variability of opportunities, the expected tenure in the fishery, and the regional, social, and environmental conditions. So you can imagine we could explore the fishery in this concept using these as other axes to understand the dimensions in which fishers exist as like a social being. This is important because DMR did this really cool survey that kind of somehow asked the exact same questions and answered a lot of what we were curious about, which is like their economic dependency on the lobsters. Are they making more money? What are they concerned about, right? Turns out it's not climate change, it's regulations and the cost of bait. And then this really cool figure and question that they asked, how do you feel about the fisher? Are you optimistic? Despite how hard it's been, according to a lot, people are still really optimistic about the fishery, which allows us to think that maybe there would still be more investment, right? But how does that actually realize itself into fishing effort? Does that mean that people are going to be buying bigger boats but fishing in less traps? Are they going to be taking more trips? Are they going to be taking less trips? As costs of bait continue to increase, but there's a huge amount of market uncertainty and regulatory uncertainty paired with the changes in the ecosystems that are happening. A fisher could easily think it might be better to buy a bigger boat. It might be better to try to optimize for offshore fishing, wait for that license to show up, and once I'm out there, I don't have to fish that often. I can only go once a week, but I can do that all year round and fish all of my traps. But if there's a trap reduction and the cost of bait is still really high, their cost reduction strategies may fall apart, and the people that remain in the fishery or able to weather that may be a completely different class of fishers. We don't know what that looks like, so it's really important for us to sort of ask these questions and keep that in mind while we do these things. I'm going to model this or attempt to model this using the agent-based model. We need to quantify the fisher behavior somehow. That's really hard, so I'm just going to simulate it. And the mental models that we made really helps us inform what that agent-based model might look like. We're going to be working with Miguel, who is more brilliant than me, to figure out how we're going to actually connect this to ecosystem dynamics. And ideally, we will have emergent behaviors in the shifts of fishing effort and fleet dynamics in different climate, economic, and management scenarios. This is us. Thank you so much for your time.
Questions?
I'm curious about kind of, I guess, the scale at which you're looking. From some of my experience with fishermen is that they will ebb and flow between those four sort of cost savings, like over the course of a season, or, some of that kind of stuff is like very responsive to the current moment, because I think a lot of times, obviously, fisheries management, we're talking about like a long scale, and that's easier to collect data on, and some of this, it's like fine scale decision making. So I'm curious like how you're addressing that or looking at that of like those changes within a season, and if you're accounting for that at all.
Yeah, no, when we were doing these interviews, the short term we determined to be like, yes, sort of like your day to day. So they're thinking about like what's the weather like, what's the time of the year, what's the seasonality, what's the price. But then within that, there's a complex layer of somewhat forward thinking. So they're thinking about like, we know there's this September like lull, so they're not going to be like fishing as hard that much. So that's the time they put in their traps and get ready to go offshore, for example, right? I think it will be in the agent-based model and how we're trying to understand this. We're thinking about it as like a very daily sort of decision, and we are trying to emulate the seasonality of it through the drivers. So that would be the changes, the seasonal changes in price, or like the changes in temperature, or like weather risk. If you were like, yeah, it's hard, which is why we haven't really done this before. And if it seems obvious to people who are like familiar with fishery, that's great. Like it should be, like it should represent the fishery in the way that we understand it. The hard part is, what do we do with that information that's actually going to be helpful for management?
Carla. He's passing the mic.
Hi, thanks, Jay. I guess along it's a good transition that you're just saying. So I guess I'm wondering, are you going to be collecting more data to go into the agent-based model, or so what is that methodological process for you to start to inform and build that model?
Yeah, the original plan was, after we sort of figured out what the actual key decisions and drivers were, we would follow up with an industry survey working with like the Maine Coast Fishermen's Associations, no, MCCF. Can I help me out? MCFA? Yes. Yes. Sorry. To follow up with essentially being like, this is a decision that we found that you guys really care about, like how important is it from like 0 to like 100% in increments? Like if prices were to go up 5%, would you do this less, more often? They haven't done that survey yet, mostly because this work took a lot of time, and then DMR did their survey, and then the cost survey that we were going to do got delayed. So like there's time still to do this. The goal, I think, the hope, I think, is as I build out the structure of the model based on these as the drivers for the agent behaviors, we can come up with a survey where we will be able to actually tune and parameterize how the behaviors actually turn out. So eventually, yes, not right now.
Jay, really nice talk. Is it possible to use the new 100% harvester reporting as like a validation on this?
That's a question to ask Nathan.
Yeah. So Nathan, what do you think? Sorry, I was thinking with how Jay's setting up the model that could the 100% harvester reporting be used to validate the model, right? In terms of how hard do people fish, when they're fishing, under what weather conditions, right? Where they're fishing. A lot of the questions that are in Jay's model are probably in that harvester reporting, maybe? I don't know.
As far as, I guess you're speaking to this.
Right, because
Yeah, I'll bring it over to you.
Yeah, there's probably some opportunity to answer some of that there. I would say the harvester reporting is a little more strictly tied to gear specifics and maybe less some of the personal investment, divestment drivers that Jay was talking about before. But that's also, you know, all that data is more or less available in the partial reporting as well that's extrapolated out. So I would have to sort of compare it, I guess, side by side a little bit. So it's a definite maybe. Yeah, sure. Absolutely, maybe.
I might just add to that. I don't have a question for you, Jay, but I think for a number of the talks today, thinking about the this type of modeling, combination of harvester reporting and dealer reporting, if it became a management priority to do a management strategy evaluation, I think all of this work will probably feed into that because we need to consider, if you're thinking the larger picture, you need to consider all of these decisions.
See MSE and that stock assessment.
We'll see what the managers do.
That was great, Jay. I've really loved watching this work progress. I'm curious if there was anything that came out in the mental model that surprised you.
In many ways, no. I think the things that do surprise me are sort of like the implications of what this actually means for like fishing effort or investment. Like it was really validating to see like all of your talks from the store lab to be like, yeah, this matches up to what we think is happening. It was really validating to see the DMR survey. It was also, and like you can see the trend in licenses in both sides and everything over time. I think it's the question of whether or not if this is actually going to be, if this trend can persist, and if it does, what does that actually look like on the shore for like who has access to, who has this access, right? If people are trying to fish more offshore, but there's a limited number of licenses that could do that, then, you know, how do they just, here's an economic perspective, how does the distribution of rents from the fishery play out across the community in which who actually benefits from lobster fishing and how does that trickle down into the community? So those are the things, I think I thought a lot more about the implications of it after this exercise.